So our Hawaiian volcano summary this week. Kīlauea's earthquakes cycled up and then back down again over this past weekend. And they've been quiet for most of this past week. You can see this plot for the last month of earthquake rates per day. This is a third cycle this month, and each one has reached similar levels of earthquake counts between 300 and 400 earthquakes per day. But this most recent pulse has been the shortest, lasting only 2 days. The one prior was perhaps twice as long, and the one before that was maybe 3 times as long. So not to say that that means anything for the future, just an interesting note of how the pattern has been decreasing here recently. And that's consistent with these pulses of magma coming into Kīlauea, pressurizing it underground, and then depressurizing by moving into one of these other areas underground, whether it's the Southwest Rift, as we saw back in October and in late January and early February, or down into the Koaʻe fault zone, as we've seen more recently, and abutting against that Upper East Rift connector as well. So that's the whole area, still the same as been impacted. The ground has been uplifting in that area of the South Caldera and the Koaʻe fault zone, which you see here on this map of earthquakes over the last week. Clusters of earthquakes in the South Caldera and in that Upper East Rift connector area right there. Both on the edges of this Koaʻe fault zone triangle, which is the area that's been adjusting the most. Over the last 3 months since the intrusion of the Southwest Rift Zone, areas in the South Caldera, Upper Koaʻe have risen by about a foot or 30 centimeters in that time. So the ground certainly is moving. The volcano is filling quite a bit, but it has been able to adjust through those movements of the ground without having to have an eruption, as occurred most recently in September of last year. Looking at our ground tilt at the Sand Hill Station, this green line indicates more of a South Caldera area. And over the last few weeks here, you can see that it had a larger increase in tilt before stabilizing and deflating slightly. And over the last week or so has started to rise once again in the South Caldera area. Halemaʻumaʻu, which is proxied by this blue line, has a little bit more subdued pattern, but also more subdued deflation. And we saw inflation beginning at Halemaʻumaʻu earlier in this pattern by a few days, showing that both the Halemaʻumaʻu area and the South Caldera areas are all uplifting and tilting as magma pressurizes beneath them. So similar story to before, there's no expectation of an eruption shortly until the earthquakes pick back up. But as we've seen, that can happen pretty quickly, and it's just a waiting game to see whether the volcano can adjust enough or whether one of these pulses eventually brings enough magma to high pressure quickly enough to actually force an eruption. That's the story on Kīlauea, whereas Maunaloa remains very quiet still, and earthquakes per week were still quite low. And looking at deformation, the spread of the north and southern points of Maunaloa's caldera, you can see here that it continues to expand and move further apart, showing magma is still coming into the system and pushing apart, and also likely indicating some flank motion as Maunaloa also adjusts to Kīlauea's movement. And that's our Hawaiian volcano summary this week.